Amen. Well, I know that I'm introducing you to some things that you've never heard before. I am an old landmark Baptist. That's what they call Orthodox Baptist or Missionary Baptist or Old Southern Baptist. Because there was a time that they were all Southern Baptist. And I'm going to read from a book to you tonight in 1907. And this is the Southern Baptist Convention of Faith, or Southern Baptist Convention, a statement of faith on the Lord's Supper. All right? I'm going to read this to you. This book is Systematic Theology by Augustus H. Strong. You got one of these?
Yeah, that's got about every subject.
Yeah, it's got about everything in there that you can think of, and it quotes everybody.
You can find something.
All right.
You can find it big enough to read it.
Yes. Be nice if it had large print, you know.
You have to use glasses.
Yeah, without reading glasses or a magnifying glass or a magnifying page or whatever you have to use. Anyway, last week we had 2 hours discussion on the Lord's Supper. We're not leaving the Lord's Supper until we understand it. The best I could give you to it, okay? Is this all right with you, Brother Bill? This is a very misunderstood subject, especially in Baptist works today. Before 1950, there were no discrepancies in the Lord's Supper, in the administration of it, or the way they took it at all among Baptist churches. After that, things went a little bit haywire. Sometimes some associations of Baptist churches would even take the Lord's Supper when they came together, and that was other churches. The Southern Baptist Convention stood against that. J.R. Graves stood against it. John A. Broadus, A.T. Robertson, Ben Bogard. Many people stood and fought for the small, delicate issues of the Lord's Supper. Now, I've given you a little deal. Mrs. Marilyn's handwriting. See this? This is Marilyn's handwriting, because I knew you couldn't read mine as easily, and I think you can read hers a lot better. But I'm going to read you a statement of faith by the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, like I said, this book was copyrighted in 1907. Okay? I think this is one of the best statements of faith on the Lord's Supper that I have ever seen anywhere.
What's the name of the book?
Augustus H. Strong, Systematic Theology. All right. Prerequisites to participation in the Lord's Supper. And I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit how the Mennonites, at this period of time, how they celebrated the Lord's Supper. Okay? Because Mennonite and Baptists are very closely related to Anabaptists. Okay? There are prerequisites. This we argue from the fact that Christ enjoined the celebration of the supper not upon the world at large, but only to His immediate disciples. All right? And this, of course, was the church. That the apostle injunctions to Christians to separate themselves from certain of their number imply a limitation of the Lord's Supper to a narrower body, even among professed believers. That the analogy of baptism as belonging only to a specified class of persons leads us to believe that the same is true of the Lord's Supper. Now, it gets smaller. So, out come the magnifiers. As the regeneration is instantaneously and sanctification continues in time, so baptism should be for once, the Lord's Supper often. The first single and second frequent. If one ordinance, the supper, requires discernment of the Lord's body, so does the other, the ordinance of baptism. The subject of baptism should know the meaning of this and his act that he's about to perform. The order of the ordinances teaches Christian doctrine as the ordinances do. To partake of the Lord's Supper before being baptized is to say in symbol that one can be sanctified without being regenerated. Both ordinances should be public, as both show forth the Lord's death and are teaching ordinances. No celebration of either one is permitted in private. All right? You can't do this in your home or any other place or any gathering or whatever. This is a church ordinance. Okay? A church ordinance. In both, the administrator does not act at his own option. Who's the administrator? The church. The church is the administrator of baptism and the Lord's Supper. But is the organ of the church. Philip acts as an organ of the church at Jerusalem when he baptizes the eunuch. The ordinances stand by themselves and are not to be made appendages of other meetings or celebrations. They belong not to associations or conventions, but to the local church only. All right. The Lord's Supper needs the scrutiny of the communicant's qualifications as much as baptism, and only the local, visible church is the proper judge of these qualifications. We may deny the Lord's Supper to one whom we know to be a Christian when he walks disorderly. Corinthians. Or disseminates the false doctrine, just as we may deny baptism to such a person. Number 11. Fencing the tables or warning the unqualified not to partake of the Lord's Supper may, like instruction, be regard to baptism, best take place before the actual administration of this ordinance. And the pastor is not to be the policeman, but the church itself. All right. On down here, it talks of Mennonites. Now, this was a Southern Baptist in 1907. Does that sound sound? It's definitely sound. That's from the Scriptures. Then we're going to go to this in just a minute. The Mennonites. The Mennonites, now, remember what year this is. 1907. The Mennonites, in the same way. The Mennonites are a very strict sect of people. If Baptists did something one way, Mennonites sometimes would emphasize it even stronger. Now, in a Mennonite church at this period of time, not all Mennonite churches, because we're talking about Mennonites in general. There are denominations of Mennonites, there are denominations of Baptists today. And I want to say one thing, that some churches that say they are Baptists have never been Baptist. Free Will Baptists have never been Baptist, period. They're not Baptist at all. Some Baptist churches that call themselves Baptists today are not. They don't meet the requirements, because we went down and looked at the 11 essential elements of a New Testament church. You know, we've gone through that to some extent. All right. Now we got stuck on this one right here, so we're looking at it. The Mennonites, in general, and particular, so to speak, the orthodoxy of Mennonites, before they took the Lord's Supper, every person had to confess his or her sins. The pastor and the deacons examined every person in the church that was going to participate of the Lord's Supper before they took the Lord's Supper. Of course, they added foot washing with the deal, but they were very specific in participating in the Lord's Supper. All right, let's go on. I don't need these now.
Just in front of the pastor, the deacon,
well,
the whole congregation.
they had 2 or 3 hour services, brother, and every one of them went up there, and they if there was any disorderly walk or anything else, and of course we have to realize this: to administer and to minister discipline. Can you go and just walk into a church someplace and be disciplined by that church? That's not going to happen. If discipline is a prerequisite to the Lord's Supper, you've got to be a member of that particular church for that to happen. And down through history, Baptists always practice close communion. Not closed, but close communion. There's open communion, there is closed communion, and there is close communion. Close communion means that you are a member of the church where the Lord's Supper is being administered. And only in that avenue can that church discipline those members. All right? Simple as that. Now let's go on a little bit further. We're going to get this. Now, we just read it from the Baptist Confession of Faith in 1907, the Southern Baptist Confession of Faith. All right? And this here is who instituted the Lord's Supper. Who was it?
Jesus.
Jesus. All right? Who did he institute it to?
His disciples.
Well, his church. All right? His church. All right? We might call them disciples, but they were actually a church. The church was already baptizing now, and the church was already evangelizing. Now the church is going to participate. This is the last act that he does with his church, by the way. The last act. Okay? To what has the Lord's Supper been delivered? The church. All right? 1 Corinthians 11:23-26. The Corinthian letter was written to the church of God at what? Corinth. All right? Corinthians 1:1 and 2. Then, evidently, the supper was delivered to the church as such. What is the purpose of the Lord's Supper? What's the answer? 1 Corinthians 11:26. Do this in remembrance of me. It does not confer grace upon anyone. There are some limitations. The Lutheran Church and the Presbyterian Church says that anybody can take the Lord's Supper with them, so to speak. And that the Lord confers the grace upon the believers and judgment upon the unbelievers. If you're an unbeliever and you take it with them, then you're damned. Judgment comes upon you. If you're not, then, and there, by the way, there are Lutheran churches that have practiced closed communion also, but many of them practice open communion. Many churches practice open communion today. All right? 1 Corinthians 11:26. Is the Lord's Supper restricted to baptized believers? Do we have any objection to that? No. Answer is Matthew 28:18-20 and Acts 2:41 and 42. Okay? Should the disorderly members be permitted to partake of the Lord's Supper? Answer in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 6. What is that? No. All right. So that, how can a church that you don't become a member of discipline you? So you have to be, when one thing is specified, all other things are rejected. All right. Should the people of bad character be permitted to partake of the Lord's Supper? 1 Corinthians 5 and 11. No. Was that church in Corinth, was it allowed to fellowship everybody that was in the church? Was that church allowed to fellowship everybody in the church?
Which question are you on?
No, I'm just asking you a question. I'm throwing one in between here.
Fellowship means
Have communion with them as a church, not as the Lord's Supper. No, they were supposed to ostracize. The Mennonites, when somebody was out of fellowship with them, that was that. They were out of fellowship. No business dealings, no nothing. They were just out of fellowship. That's the way they did. They do that today in most of the Mennonite communities. I'm not just saying open, just Mennonite churches, but where people live in a communal type setting. Number 7, is the Lord's Supper restricted to those of the same faith? Absolutely. And not all can say that of the same church, from what we've learned so far. How can you partake of the Lord's Supper, which is a local church ordinance, and being a member of another church? You can do it. Do you think you're doing it rightly? All right. Is the Lord's Supper restricted to those in fellowship at a church? In a church? All right. Acts 2:41 and 42. You want to go to that, Brother David? Acts 2:41 and 42. Acts 2:38. Baptized because of the remission of sin, not for them, but because of them. Are you there, David?
Yeah, just about there. 2:41 and 42.
Yeah.
Then they gladly received his word, were baptized, and the same day they were added unto them about 3,000 souls. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and breaking of bread and prayers.
All right. Many times the word breaking of bread there is talking about the Lord's Supper, because they had one loaf which represented the whole offering that the Lord made, and of the one body of believers that was partaking of it. Number 9. Must those who take of it be able to discern the Lord's body? The answer is 1 Corinthians 11:27 through 29. Yeah, definitely. They have to discern. Must the supper be restricted to a united church? Well, Paul condemned the Corinthian church for taking the Lord's Supper, and they were not in unity. I had a man tell me one time that a pastor, that they hadn't taken the Lord's Supper in the church that he pastored for 20-something years. He said if they took the Lord's Supper, they would all die. Well, there needs to be some revival. I remember one time, this is I think Brother Art Richardson told me about this one time when he was preaching in the chapel there at the seminary. He said, there's an old story about a preacher that went back into a local community, and he was going to preach a revival. And before when the revivalists got there, the pastor says, "Now, brother, I don't want you preaching about drinking, because there's some of our people that take a social drink." He said, you need to lay off of smoking, because some of our people smoke. And you need to lay off of card playing, because on Wednesday night, once a month, the deacons get together and play cards. And on and on and on and so forth. And he says, well, what can I preach on? And the preacher looked around for just a little while, and he said, I'll tell you what, preach against them Campbellites. There aren't one of them here. Campbellites Church of Christ. Won't offend them at all, because they're not coming. Well,
but this 1 Corinthians 11, 16, 17, there's more to it than that. I mean, he was rebuking them for coming there and eating the Lord's Supper as a meal.
That's right. They had the Lord's Supper every meal. They were taking the Lord's Supper every day.
They were getting drunk and
disorderly, and but it's restricted to a united church and a doctrinally sound church. They should be doctrinally sound. The people should be doctrinally sound. Okay, the next one, number 11. Must the supper be restricted to those who have undergone self-examination? 1 Corinthians 11 and 28. What does that say?
Let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of that cup. All
right. Okay. Now that's as a local church member too. Now, if the supper was free to everyone, there would be no need of self-examination, would it? The object of self-examination is evidently to determine whether the justifications for eating have been met. Number 12. Has the church a right to judge? 1 Corinthians 5, 12, and 13. The church has to. Not only does it have a right, it has a command to. All right? From the foregoing passages, we see that the individual who would partake of the supper must examine himself. In addition to this, church must demand that the individual who partakes must be sound in faith and of good character and in fellowship and able to discern the Lord's body. This is what Baptists mean by close communion.
Can I ask a question on this?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It says, For what have I to do to judge them also that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, he's talking about the type of people that are in verse 11 and verse 10, correct? In 9, 10, and 11. Isn't that a reference to those verses?
It is
people that are not of the faith.
Yeah. They don't judge the people outside the church, but in the church. Period. He's given all kinds of commands, talking about the Lord's Supper. He's talking about bringing each other to law in the courts and everything. He's emphasizing that the church is to make discernments. Church is to make discernments. All right, now where were we in our little 11 elements of New Testament church? I've got to find that now. Here we are. I think we got down to this one place and we got totally stumped, didn't we? Right down there. The right ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper. All right. The next one, it must have the right offices, pastors and deacons. Pastors and deacons. All right. Pastors and deacons. What is a pastor?
He's the administrator of the church.
Well,
He's the
pastor is a pastor of the church. Roger has said many times there are probably 200 pastors in this church. At least. 200 pastors in this church. Pastors are ordained officers in a church. They're ordained officers in a church. That they baptize. They can administer in the Lord's Supper. They can preach, teach, all these things. That's what a pastor does. And a pastor in particular, now we're in a big church. We've got 7,000 to 10,000 members here, and probably 10,000 people at least attending this church often, on and off, especially. But as you go back to a little church, most of them are lucky to get one pastor. There are other churches that are without pastors all over the country. They don't have any pastors. But a pastor is someone that preaches and teaches and administers the ordinances in a church. Now, deacons. What is a deacon? Diaconia. Deacon. Pastor, by the way, is episkopos. Episkopos means overseer. That means to look, watch over. And it's also, the Word of God calls pastors, He calls them shepherds.
Can you write that in episkopos on the board?
Oh, episkopos? All right, episkopos. That's Greek. That's what it is, okay? This is where we get our word episcopal. All right? It's from that word. If you want something like that, I'll do that. Is that all right? Is that okay now? Mm-hmm. All right. Right officers, pastors. That is the one that does the preaching, and deacons. Now, Philip, in the book of Acts, Philip was a member of the Jerusalem church. Now, he was out preaching one day, wasn't he, when he met the Ethiopian eunuch. All right? And he preached to him, and what else did he do? He baptized him. All right? By church authority he did, because he was a member of that church in Jerusalem.
Baptism doesn't have to be in the whole church like this, like a communion day.
Well, it's a local church. Baptism and the Lord's Supper is a local church ordinance. You can't just be ordained and go out and just start baptizing people. It's done by church authority.
It's okay to baptize someone, just one, you and the person being baptized, with no other church members around.
Well, he did that, but he did it with church authority. You have to realize that when a missionary goes out, they go out and they missionize an area. They do this to this day. They go out and they baptize people. That's what they do. That's what a missionary does. And that's what Philip did. All right? He didn't baptize a person, but the church did, because the church gave him the authority.
Most missionaries have home churches from which they're sent out.
That's right. All right. And when that person that is baptized, he is also becomes a member of that church. From where that person is from. Now they can start another church. They organize churches out beyond that as little churches, like we had out of this church at one time. All right, do you have any problems on that one? We got it all down. Okay. All right. The church must have the right work objectives, making disciples, baptizing, and teaching the rules of the kingdom. Matthew 28:16 through 20. 18 through 20, if you want to put that down there specifically. As you've been kicked out, make disciples. The disciples, what do you do with the disciples? Dip them. You baptize them. And then what do you do to them? Teach them some more. Teaching them to guard with their lives those certain doctrines that we have handed down to you. All right? Jesus said, "Lo, I'll be with you until the end of the age." All right. Number 9. It must have the right financial plan, tithes and offerings. 1 Corinthians 9:14. What does it say there? 1 Corinthians 9:14. Let's go look at this one, because this is a bone of contention in churches today. All right, you got that, Brother David?
Yep. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live the gospel.
Live the gospel. All right. And what does that mean there?
You get paid for your work.
Pastors are to be paid. All right. In other places, it tells them that of course, all the way back in the book of Genesis, we know that there was tithing going on back there in the book of Genesis. You know, Abraham tithed, and if you really look down, one of the problems of Cain, one of Cain's sins was what? Not giving the right amount when he came to make his offering. All right? And nowhere in Scriptures will you find where we should have money-raising campaigns. Yard sales, cupcake sales, candy sales. And in real Baptist churches, you will not see that.
Church is supposed to be self-supported.
It's supposed to be supported by the members of the church. That's one thing. We have, in this church, we have youth groups and stuff, and they will have fundraising things for something that they're doing. But the church is supported by tithes and offerings. It's not supported by candy sales. It's not supported by financial ventures. It's supported by the members giving.
Owning Coca-Cola.
What?
Like owning Coca-Cola,
Okay.
like that.
Really, in reality, the youth group should not be allowed to solicit outside of the church as well.
Well, it's a youth group. It's not a youth group is not a church. It is a function of the church. Youth groups in Baptist churches, sometimes they'll here at 4th of July they have isn't that the group that has the fireworks sales and stuff?
Children's ministry.
The children's ministry. All right, the children's ministry. They'll have that. But as far as supporting this church, it is done by the support of the members of the church only. That's it. But there are other churches. You can go to any big supermarket, and most of the time of the year, especially from now on, they will not be selling things. Peanut brittle, cupcakes, all kinds of stuff. Even, the Catholic Church uses what to raise funds? All kinds of gambling activities, like bingo. Yeah, bingo. That's one of the things. Catholic Church do anything to raise money.
I work with a guy that goes to a Catholic church, and he runs the beer booth.
Yeah.
That's their biggest money maker.
Yeah.
He said the pastor of that church bought $200 worth of beer
Yeah.
himself. He said they all get drunk.
Yeah.
To them, it's no big deal.
Maybe he didn't want to misuse the sacraments.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right. Well, that's it.
Money maker.
Yeah. They do this. My Packard, my green Packard, the green Packard that I have, the 53 Clipper, was donated to Garce's church up there, and it was lotteried off. And lottery tickets, that church, they donated that thing to that church, and then they had a lottery ticket, and this guy won it for $20, a $20 lottery ticket. That's how. I didn't get it. I got it from the guy that won it. I didn't buy the ticket.
There's nothing wrong with a pastor having a job, working, and even not getting paid in a little tiny poor little community, being a pastor and not making a
Most
living.
pastors in churches do work.
They have to.
They do work. There are very few mega churches that pastors really are have a livelihood by the church. Many of them don't. All right, but the churches should support them to every means that they can. A pastor is not some super CEO. You know what that is? Company executive officer, chief executive officer. But many of them look at big churches like this as the pastors being big CEOs. It's not that. Corporate America has really brought a lot of problems into churches and things. I want to just give you a little something here. This is just beyond free. I'm not going to charge you for this at all. Okay? Do you know what what the average CEO makes compared to the workers that he is over?
10,000 times as much, or not 1,000 times as much.
If a guy makes $10 an hour,
Astronomically more.
the CEOs of some of these companies make 370 times more than that. Now, I don't really think that is. I don't think it's logical, for one thing, and I don't think it's moral either.
You know how to manipulate the stock market.
We've got a lot of problem with America right now with this very thing, and I think CEOs are a special group. I think they ought to make maybe 3 times more, 4 or 5, maybe even 10 times more in extreme things. But 370 times the salary of the people that are working under them?
I think in a lot of cases it's much more than that.
Well, I'm talking about average, brother. Sometimes it might be 1,000 times. But the average, now they just did a survey of this, the average is 370 times. That's a lot of money, people. That's why Ford went broke. That's why many of these big businesses go. That's what happened with Enron. That's what happens with some of these big drug companies and everything else.
One of those guys got sentenced to a bunch of time in prison, didn't he?
Yeah. Now let's go on from here. I thought I'd just throw that one in there. Okay. It must have the right means of propagation and defense. All right. How do we support and defend our church? How many of you have firearms? Oh, everybody here just about. Now, I don't think that we should ever take our firearms and come down to the church and go out as church groups and... I don't think that's the way we should disciple people. At gunpoint. I mean, the Catholic Church did this for many years, and the Muslims have done this for almost 1,500, 1,400 years.
That was the sixth part of Calvinism.
Yeah. Now, that's not the way you support the church, the way you defend the church. You defend the church by 2 Corinthians 10 and 4, Ephesians 6 and 10 through 20. We use spiritual weapons of warfare. We use the Word of God. If that doesn't work, forget it. You can't go out and force anybody to be saved. You hear that, Dakota? Don't go out with a knife now and try to convert your friends to become Baptist. That's not the right way to do it. Jacob, where are you? You don't go out and get your toy knife now and go down there and start jabbing the neighbor and say, you're going to be a Baptist or I'll kill you. All right? We don't do that. Now, there are churches that do that. There are denominations that do that. Every church that came out of Catholicism sooner or later became a state church someplace, but not Baptist. I'm so happy to say that Baptists have never become a state church anyplace.
Neither did Mennonites.
Yeah, no, Mennonites didn't either. Well, they were Baptists. I lump Mennonites as Baptists. Okay, I lump the Amish as Baptist. And in some places they went a little bit too far. Some places we haven't gone far enough. Simple as that. One time we lived like them. Baptists lived like that. Number 11. It must have independence from all earthly powers. It must be sovereign and have the absolute separation of church and state, and absolute separation of church and convention, and absolute separation of church and association.
We don't practice that today.
Yeah. But we, churches are getting a little bit too politically minded.
Just in the fact that we are a tax-exempt corporation means that we don't practice that.
Well,
Because of that, we are under the guise of the federal government and have to follow their rules and regulations of that.
We're going to get down into this on down the line just a little bit.
Okay.
There are primitive Baptists among us today that will not do any of those things. They will not even register as a non-profit organization. They won't do it. They won't do a lot of other things either. All right? Now, we have finished this. We have finished the Lord's Supper. Are we satisfied with that? As satisfied as we're going to get? All right?
When they come back, you'll have to go over it more.
No, I'm going to give them the tape.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the Paulicians. Now, how many of you have this?
Oh, I left that at home.
You left it at home. Well, I have an extra.
I didn't think we'd get out of this.
Well, we did it. All right. You've got your... See, the girls really keep things organized.
Yeah, well, they're better students than guys.
They got more brains than guys. Women are stronger than men. They're smarter than men. And they're more enduring and tougher than men in so many ways. Now we're going to learn a lot about church history from this little thing. I've always used this as I studied church history because this is something, you know, I have a lot of books. I used to have a lot more books than what I have today, but I have a lot of books. But what do I do in my books, Marilyn?
Read them and mark them.
Read them and mark them up. My wife got this book here is printed in 1798. Do you see how marked up this book is? She said, "What did you do that for?" I said, "Because it's my book and I read it." "What if somebody wanted to copy it?" I said, "Here it is, it's copied. Don't worry about it." All right. Right now I can go back, I can find that page. Used to have it absolutely 567, 568 in my mind. You know, this is where it was. I marked the thing, I went down there, I marked the things out here like this, and I wrote out to the side the things that I wanted to teach because I've been teaching from this book for 30 years. I asked Brother I.K. Cross one time, Brother Cross, have you read the doctrinal statement of the Paulicians in John Lawrence von Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History of the Christian Church? And he says, no. And so I took it, and I showed it to him, and he sat there with his eyes wide open and his mouth open. Man, this is one of the best statements of Baptist that I've ever read in my life. And he said, let me copy this thing. So he went and copied it. And he took it and copied the thing. I read my history books. I've read Neander's, the Ante-Nicene, Nicene, Post-Nicene Fathers, and Mosheim's history. I don't mark every page up, but where I run into something that's real important, it's going to get scribbled on. I don't care if it's 200 years old. I've got a book at home that's printed in 1766, and you know what I did with that book? I marked it up. I did have one that was printed in 1703. And I started to mark that book up, and I said, this book is special. So I went down and I copied it. And I marked the copy up. And Brother Cross wanted the original, and I've got the only copy of that's Wall's History of Infant Baptism because his house burned and his library burned, and that book went with it. That was a very, very rare book, Wall's History of Infant Baptism. Well, I read all these books. When somebody quotes, like John T. Christian, or this guy here, this Carol, when they quote somebody, I go back and find out where they quoted. Then I read and find out if they quoted it in context. John T. Christian is an honest man. Not every Baptist history that I've ever read is an honest book. They may be propagating what they believe, but they're misquoting people and things. When I quote somebody, I try to do it. I try to give you the book that I'm quoting it from. Okay? I give you the page. All right. In our little thing here, the doctrines of it says the divisions and heresies. That's how it's entitled. And if you look over to the side, we have the 11th century. In other words, that's about 1000 A.D. All right? And these people had lived and believed these things for 800 years before. All right? If you look on the left-hand side of the paper, look and see some of the things that these people were called. It says that these people, their piety was blackened by the accusations and were evidently false, and that the opinions for which they were punished differ wildly from the Manichaean system. It's talking about Anabaptists and these Paulicians and Manichaeans. Manichaeans were kind of a Pentecostal type spiritualist people, okay? Spiritualist. As far as we can see, in this case, it appears to us that these pretended Manichaeans and Orleans were a set of mystics who looked upon contempt with all external worship and rejected all rites and ceremonies, even the Christian sacraments, as a destitute of any spiritual meaning. All right, let's go on down. And then we find out that there's a vast numbers out of Italy in the following ages, spread like inundations and a flood all through European provinces, were known in Germany under the name of Brethren. What are the terms of these called? The Brethren. The Mennonites. All right, that's who we're talking about. All right. Mennonites and the Anabites. We're on page 566. All right, over there to the left-hand column. We find in history another branch of this numerous sect whose errors were not accompanied with the crimes that were laid in charge of their brethren, and were converted by the pathetic discourse and addressed them by Gerhard, Bishop of Gambri and Arras, in an assembly of the clergy that was held in the last of these two cities, A.D. 1030. All right? Now, these are the things that these people believed. All right? Let's go down. These were called Paulicians. And these are the things that they believed. All right? Number one. See that number one mark there? They rejected baptism in a special manner, the baptism of infants, as a ceremony that was in no respect essential to salvation. What have Baptists always taught about baptism? The Donatists. Thousands of them were killed because they only would baptize adults, and they wouldn't accept anybody else's baptism as valid. Okay? Baptism of infants. They rejected baptism. They didn't reject baptism. They rejected the authority to baptize by any other groups but their own. They said, we have the authority from the Lord. The Lord's churches were given this authority, and it's never been given to anybody else. It sure wasn't given to Calvin, sure wasn't given to Luther, sure wasn't given to the Catholic Church. After the Catholic Church nullified their standing with the Lord. And they said that they didn't believe in the baptism of infants, and they didn't believe that baptism was essential to salvation. Now, we have any problems with that? All right. Number two. Can you read that for me, David? Can you read this Old English?
They rejected for the same reason the sacraments of the Lord's Supper.
All right. The sacraments of the Lord's Supper. What is a sacrament now again? How many sacraments are there in the Catholic Church? 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church. I wish I had some of my books. I don't have them anymore. I had one called The Sacraments of the Holy Church. And there was a cardinal there that went through all these things, the 7 sacraments. Okay? One of them is the Lord's Supper, and another one is baptism, one of them is marriage, and one of them is communion, and the confession, and so on and so forth. Okay? They rejected the same reason the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. They would not take the Lord's Supper as a sacrament whatsoever. It was a local community in that church. They did not share the communion with any other church. And most of the time they wouldn't accept anybody else's baptism that they didn't know a church practiced what they practiced. Number 3, they denied that the churches were endowed with a greater degree of sanctity than private houses, and that they were more adapted to worship of God than any other place. You know that the first some of the first church houses that were ever built were built by the Holy Roman Empire under Constantine the Great. Many times in the early first 200 years history of the churches, true churches, they met in people's houses. Sometimes whole synagogues were converted and they met in the synagogue. But they knew what the word church meant. It means an assembly of people wherever they assembled, whether it was in a cave or wherever it was. That was their assembly place. That was their church. And it was not a church house. It was not a synagogue, so to speak. It was not a building, but it's the people that are meeting in that.
The church body.
The church body. Now it said they rejected the same reasons as sacraments, and they denied that the sanctity was any more than in their houses and in the worship of God in a church. Go back. This is from 300 to 1000 AD. This is what these people are teaching now. From 300 AD to 1000 AD. They didn't believe in church houses. Constantine built great big church houses because in church houses they put baptismal fonts. What's a baptismal font? And early, even in the Catholic Church now, baptism was by immersion only. They did not baptize anybody by pouring, by sprinkling at all. They baptize them by immersion. In the early church houses, you can go back, I've seen those churches, and they go in there, and some of them were cathedrals, but some of them were coliseums, so to speak. Sometimes there's thousands of people, so they meet in a coliseum or whatever. But in a house, they would have a baptismal font, and they would go dip them. It had to be big enough to dip. And a lot of places, water is a rarity, isn't it? It's hard to come by. But when you baptize somebody, you got to have enough water to dip them in, don't you? So they had baptismal fonts.
Wally was saying on his trip in front of where they believed that John and Mary resided in Turkey, that there was a baptismal there.
Yeah.
In front of their house.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've been preaching long already. We covered a lot of ground tonight, though, haven't we? Okay. You enjoying this? Are you learning something? Okay. Now, in Catholic churches, there are vaults, and there are vaults in the floor where they bury people. You know why they bury people in Catholic churches? To get them to heaven. It's holy ground.
Isn't
According
that
to
one of their 7 sacraments?
Well, yeah, and you have last rites, and you have the funeral services and all that. Baptists stood hard against this for hundreds of years. Every church had a cemetery. The most important people and the biggest shots in the church were buried in the church house, in the walls of the church, or in the floor of the church. Then those that had a little lesser, if you go over some of these Catholic missions over there, you'll find a lot of people buried in the floor and buried in the walls, and then outside, close to the church house, are the most important people. The closer to the church house, the more important you have to have, and the more important and the more money you have to give to get your victim buried there. All right. They affirmed also that the altars were to be considered in no other light than heaps of stones, and they were unworthy of any marks of veneration and regard. Altars. Altars. What's an altar? In a Catholic church, you have an altar up there in front of it. And it's usually got some statue on it or something. Up there behind it, you've got a crucifixion a crucifix of Jesus. Up there in these early churches, Catholic churches, how are Catholic churches named? After saints. St. Paul's Cathedral, St. John's, and all this kind of stuff. They would have one of John's, some of John's underwear in his church or something, maybe his little finger, in an altar. And they would go up there and they'd kiss this thing. I was in Damascus, Syria, and in several other places where they had parts of John the Baptist. In Damascus, Syria, they got his head there, supposedly. I don't know how many heads he had in these churches. You know, here's a head over here and a head over here and whatever. Maybe they split the thing down the middle and put half of it one place and half of it the other. But what Baptists said is these altars had no merit to them, what's spiritual merit to them at all. You go up there and you kiss these bones or rags or whatever's in there, this is going to get you to heaven. It means nothing at all. They have no special, and the altar in a church. Catholics, and you'd be surprised how many Baptists have got to go to the altar to pray.
Well, the Israelites, they just built a mound of stones.
Yeah.
So that there would be nothing gaudy or...
Well, but that was where they made a sacrifice. That's where they made.
Yeah.
Well, our sacrifice has already been made.
Right.
Yeah. They used to have a mourner's bench down in front of Baptist churches, in early Baptist churches, where you went down there and you were sorry for your sins and you cried and you asked God to forgive you. The mourner's benches. Now we got steps. We go down there and kneel on the steps. All right. Number 5. They disapproved of the use of incense and consecrated oil in services of religious nature. Why? Now, what does the Catholic Church, what's the Lutheran Church, what's the Episcopalian Church, what do all of these do? Well, the use of incense and consecrated oils and services. They always got holy oil they're putting on somebody for something. They always got incense that they're burning. All of that stuff typified Jesus in the Old Testament. We don't need any of that now. Where do you find in the New Testament we're supposed to send up incense, burn incense, use oil, consecrated oil? We're supposed to anoint people with oil according to the book of James. We're going to get to that to help heal them. That's medicine is what it's talking about. I'm not talking about any holy thing. All right. Number 6. Here's interesting. They looked upon the use of bells in churches as an intolerable superstition. Bells in churches. A lot of old churches had bells in them, didn't they? For Baptist churches would not have a steeple, they would not have a cross, and they would not have a bell in it. Did you know that? Why did they use bells? In a Catholic church today, why do they use bells? Why do they ring those bells?
To ward off the
evil spirits. They're chasing off. This is evil, chasing off evil spirits. They ringing bells. They ring the bells and ring the bells and ring the bells. And they ring the bells and incense. All this stuff is supposed to chase off evil spirits. God doesn't want His people to be superstitious. He wants you to be truly religious, not superstitious. Well, this is where all this comes out of one place: false religion and paganism.
Babylon.
Yeah. They'd ring bells. Somebody's death. They'd ring bells to chase off evil spirits. Before they had church service, they'd ring the bells, ring the bells, ring the bells. Remember in the old cowboy movies, the church is ringing the bell. There weren't many bells in Baptist churches, and not very many belfries either, and no crosses. Wouldn't see that for hundreds of years. Number 7.
Can I stop you real
Yes.
quick? Why were there no crosses?
Because the Catholic Church, they had a cross in the front of every church with a Jesus on it, and they sold so many crosses and crucifixes, and they put them around their necks and everything else. This was all something that they used. When Baptists saw the misuse of one thing, they ran completely away from it.
So, in other words,
They abhorred it.
If the pagans were doing it, they
went the opposite direction. Now, Mennonites did the same thing. All right, because Mennonites are Baptists. All right. They denied the establishment of bishops and presbyters and deacons and other ecclesiastical deacons or dignities was of any divine institution went so far as to maintain that the appointment of stated ministers in the church was entirely needless. Did they think that they didn't believe in pastors and deacons? What do you have in the Catholic Church or Episcopal Church? You have archbishops, you have bishops, you have deacons, you have priests. And I can guarantee you that Baptists stood hard against this. They said that pastors and deacons are servants of God's churches. They are not ruling over the church. Bible Baptists have got a problem. Bible Baptists believe in pastor rule. Now, they may not say they believe that, but they believe in pastor rule.
Define the term Bible Baptist.
Bible Baptists, you'll see little independent Bible Baptist churches all over the place. There aren't as many now as what they used to be. They're around here in town. You'll find some in different places. You'll see Bible Baptists. John R. Rice was a Bible Baptist. He was a great instigator and rivals. He went over and they started Bible Baptist churches. But basically, the pastor is the ruler of those churches. They believe that. I went to church here a few years ago, and I preached in that church. And the church had called a Bible Baptist preacher, and it was an old-time missionary Baptist church. They called this Bible Baptist preacher for pastor, because pastors are hard to find. They called him a wonderful guy. But in that church, he took his pastoral power too far. And I mean, it tore that church up, because that old missionary Baptist church was not letting a preacher come in there and strong arm them. It just about, they tore up the church. I don't even think it exists anymore. Preachers, back at this time, deacons and pastors and bishops, they all went into these Catholic churches. And I mean, some of you have been in Catholic churches 200 and 300 years old, haven't you? 400. I've been in them 1,000 years
The
old.
only ones I've been in the old ones.
Okay, old. There aren't very many old Catholic churches in America. If you go overseas, and you'll find some of these. Okay, and always there was a pulpit up there that they spoke from down to the congregation. At that period of time, if there was a Baptist church, they dug a hole and put the preacher in the hole, and he had to preach up to the congregation. The church went down to him because he's the lowest man on the totem pole, because he's a servant. They made him preach up to him. He is our servant. Jesus said, and they said, who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? And what did he tell them? First of all, they got the soap out and the water and the towel and went around washing their feet. He said, the greatest among you will be the servant. All right. Pastors and deacons aren't needless. But as the episcopacy goes, and as in Catholicism and all of the big Protestant denominations, deacons and bishops and all that are totally unnecessary in Baptist churches. We don't have any such thing. Pastors are pastors and deacons are deacons. They're servants of the church. They affirmed that the institution of funeral rites and the effect and sacerdotal avarice, and that it was a matter of indifference whether the dead were buried in churches or in the fields. You want me to go on a little further, or you want to quit? Huh?
What do you want to do? I don't care.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll go on a little further. I was going to quit right there, but I'll go on here a little further. There's a little bit more. We can finish this page. That the institution of funeral rites. Now, Catholicism. And of course here, this guy was a Lutheran historian that wrote this book. Baptist history is not written by Baptists. Baptist history is written by enemies of Baptists. This is an enemy writing the story of our confession of faith right here. These are called Paulicians. Now, how in the world did they get the name of Paulicians? How did they get that name? Well, way back, I believe it was in 200 and something A.D., there was a missionary that went into Turkey. And he stayed in a guy's house named Constantine. This is not Constantine the Great that I'm talking about. Okay? And he stayed there. Did I tell you this story last week? A little bit of it? No? Yes? Yes? Okay. I'll tell you again. And some of you didn't hear it, because I think it told it real early in part of the class. Anyway, this guy named Constantine, he stayed with this guy named Constantine. He stayed there for years. The guy hid him out. And this guy that he hid out was a deacon. And this guy had a complete copy of the New Testament. It's all handwritten, but he had a copy. And when he left him a complete copy of the New Testament. all of Paul's writings. Most of the churches at that time only had Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, sometimes only a few pages of the Bible. I remember one time when Russia was opened up, where they could take Bibles into Russia. They went in there, and this one woman, they gave her a Bible, and she just sat down and wept. The whole town, this is way out in Russia, out in a little old hick town in Russia. They had one page of a Bible there that everybody in that town had memorized. And they saw the complete Word of God, and they were just absolutely emotionally overwhelmed by it. They had memorized one page. That one page. Do you know how lucky it is for you to have a Bible today? You know how lucky it is for you to have a Word of God? Well, this man left the complete copy of the Bible with him. And they started studying Paul's writings, and they emphasized Paul's writings. And he changed his name from Constantine to Silvanus. Okay? And these followers of these people that went out here, now all this time, these are the people right here that we're talking about, the followers that were started in this man's home. And this spread all over. They were called Paulicians because they studied the writings of Paul. They had the whole Bible. They were called Paulicians. And guess where you find out how to behave yourself in the house of God? In Paul's writings. All right. Funeral rites. I talked a little bit about that. If you want to control the masses, this is what the Catholic Church did. I'm going to try to bring a little flyer next week to you from the Primitive Baptist. Okay? This is a flyer. 5 reasons why you should not get a license to be married by the state. They're still fighting this war. They absolutely do not believe that any Christian ought to be married with a state marriage license at all. They say that's ungodly. We believe in separation of church and state. There are Baptists that still believe that to this day in America. Now, in America, Baptists didn't use marriage license until about right before World War II and right after. That's when they started getting really certificates and marriage license from the state. For all the years before that, they would never be married by a judge or a preacher. I mean, not a preacher, but any public official. Their marriages were simply recorded in Bibles, and it was between a man and a woman and God, and that was marriage to them. Now, if you want to control a people, you control when they die and when they get married, and you got to control them, don't you?
When they're born.
When they're born, the rite of baptism. When you're born, if you become a citizen of the state and of the church, and you baptize them, and then when they are married, you control them because you have to have a license by the state church to be married. And then when you die, you've got to have a license by the state church to be buried. And that's what they're talking about right here. All right. Well, it doesn't make any difference for these funeral rites. This is when purgatory was invented, and all the things. You know, how many of you have ever seen pictures of St. Peter's Square over there in the Vatican? That was built with this money, what they did right here. Number 9, they looked upon those voluntary punishments called penance, which were so generally practiced in this century as unprofitable and absurd. What can you do to get saved? Is there any torture you can run your body through to get saved? You know, because Jesus already did it, didn't He? He already went through the cross for us. If we punish ourselves for salvation, we are committing blasphemy in all reality.
Well, it's a pagan act.
It's a pagan and a blasphemous act because Jesus already did it. How many of you go to a restaurant and they always got a Friday fish special? Catholics wouldn't eat meat on Friday. All through years when I went to school, they never served meat in the cafeteria on Friday because Catholicism was so strong that they would serve fish. So that's why you always get a fish menu on Friday. I like fish, so that's fine. But that's why you got it. All right? Voluntary punishments. Say so many Hail Marys, do this or do that, or whatever. Don't eat. Don't chew bubble gum. I had one of my sons had a real good friend, and every year for Lent he'd give up something. He really liked one kind of beer, this Budweiser or something or other. I don't know what kind of beer he drank, but he liked this beer, this brand of beer. So during Lent he gave up drinking that brand of beer and he drank some other off the wall brand. But he gave up his favorite beer. Some people give up bubble gum during Lent. They give up steaks during Lent. Or some favorite food. Or they do all kinds of silly things. They're trying to suffer. Trying to suffer to get to heaven. You don't have to suffer to get to heaven. Our Lord already suffered to get to heaven. I hope you enjoyed the class. Hope you learned something from it. Brother Mike, you learned something from this class?
You always do.
All right, good. Brother David, you're learning. Irma, how about you, Jacob? You learning something? I guess. Boy, you'd be surprised what he learned. I had little kids I taught like that, years in church like that, and years later, they had great theological ideas. They had remembered all those things. Believe it or not, they do. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll turn you loose on the world. Brother Bill, would you dismiss us in prayer, please, brother?